Well, I was kind of hoping we weren't heading in this direction, but new reporting suggests that the quiet deployment of special operators in Southcom suggests we might actually be considering targeted raids inside of Venezuela. Now, to be clear, the footage that I'm showing here is just B-roll. It's 7th Group jumping in Puerto Rico, I think it was, earlier this year. This is not U.S. forces jumping into Venezuela. But here's the thing. Most Americans do not support a U.S. invasion of Venezuela. That's what the newest polling on this issue says, and we'll get into that later in today's video to include how attacking Venezuela, not the cartels, but the country, and overthrowing Maduro is kind of a partisan issue here in the United States. Now, starting out with some reporting just yesterday from Eric Schmidt at the New York Times, where he put out an article saying, quote, U.S. military buildup in the Caribbean signals broader campaign against Venezuela. Trump officials say the mission aims to disrupt the drug trade, but military officials and analysts say the real goal might be driving Venezuela's president from power. They say the 4,500-member force currently aboard 8 warships is too small to invade Venezuela or any country harboring traffickers, and it is not operating in the main body of water to carry out a major drug interdiction campaign. That would be the Eastern Pacific Ocean, regional experts say. The clandestine deployment of elite special operations forces suggests that strikes or commando raids inside of Venezuela may be in the works. And they quote Admiral James Stavridis, a former head of Pentagon's Southern Command. He says, quote, the massive naval flotilla off the coast of Venezuela and the movement of fifth-generation F-35 fighters to Puerto Rico has little to do with actual drug interdiction. They represent operational overkill. And there's a mixed bag here. We've talked in recent videos how the overall objectives are pretty vague. We've had a lot of senior officials kind of hint that, hey, regime change would be fine if it worked out. We're on board with that. But that's not the goal. Conversely, we're seeing, as the Admiral says, a massive buildup of military power. I think this is the largest buildup of U.S. military power in the Caribbean, maybe ever, at least in a long, long time. And something to consider here is that one avenue that President Trump might be pursuing is just, gunboat diplomacy, trying to pressure the Venezuelan regime and Nicolas Maduro into doing something. That something might be handing over Maduro himself, but it's a flex is one way to think of it. And to flex, you need to have enough military forces on scene to actually make that worrisome. I think back to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, leading up to that, and I'm sure there's a bunch of other really good, probably better examples, but I know President Bush, W. Bush at the time, was threatening Saddam that if you didn't meet these terms, the United States would invade along with many of our allies. That carries no weight unless we have the forces staged on the border ready to go. So he could issue those threats, and Saddam should have believed him when he made them. So if we just had one boat in the Caribbean, it doesn't carry very much weight that the U.S. is awful serious about anything in Venezuela, so it has to be a significant number. That said, this number of military personnel we have in there is quite a bit more than you might expect for standard drug interdiction missions. Now, Ian Ellis over on X put together a graphic here showing at least some of the U.S. military assets congregating, in this case, in Puerto Rico, where he notes the location of U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drones. We mentioned last week that 10 U.S. F-35B versions have arrived in Puerto Rico. We've got U.S. Navy surface combatants. We've got Navy Poseidon, P-8 Poseidon reconnaissance aircraft, and then Coast Guard cutters. Puerto Rico is kind of becoming the forward deployment point, it looks like, in terms of this ongoing fight in the Caribbean. And that, of course, is not even mentioning the 4 destroyers we have at sea, at least 1 submarine, and then the Iwo Jima Amphibious Ready Group, a number of ships there operating, again, between Puerto Rico and Venezuela. Now, a component of this element did carry out what we believe to be the 3rd strike, maybe the 4th. Kinetic strike carried out. We'll play the footage here in a second. What we know is that we've had 3 different clips released showing kinetic operations. Looks like some sort of drone strike against these ships, against these boats, go-fast boats, what they look like. President Trump a couple days ago said, we've released footage of 2, but we actually carried out 3. After that, this footage came out, so it's not entirely clear if this is the 3rd or the 4th. Either way, you get the idea. President Trump said, quote, "On my orders, the Secretary of War ordered a lethal kinetic strike on a vessel affiliated with a designated terror organization conducting narco trafficking in the U.S. Southcom area of responsibility. Intelligence confirmed the vessel was trafficking illicit narcotics and was transiting along a known narco trafficking passage en route to poison Americans. The strike killed 3 male narco terrorists aboard the vessel, which was in international waters. No U.S. forces were harmed in this strike. Stop selling fentanyl, narcotics, and illegal drugs in America and committing violence and terrorism against Americans." Now, a few notes here because we're having to do a lot of reading between the lines. To my knowledge, there's not been a DoD briefing or a Pentagon press briefing about any of this. So we're missing a lot of details. But if we look at some of the terminology used here that I think is notable, the president refers to them as a designated terror organization, but doesn't call out the organization by name, which is unique. Just a couple days ago, there was a ground raid carried out in Syria where a senior member of Islamic State was eliminated. Not clear if that was U.S. forces or a partnered operation or U.S.-supported partner operation, but either way, we called it out. A senior member of Islamic State's planning cell. In this case, we're just saying it's a designated terror organization. I'm not sure why they didn't actually put the name on it. Tren de Aragua, perhaps. They also, I think it's interesting, they go out of their way to call these male narco terrorists. Again, we don't see that thrown around a lot, generally speaking. I don't know. I mean, I think most of the time it's assumed that enemy combatants are male, but that stands out because, again, when we carry out a strike, say in Syria or Pakistan or going back, Afghanistan and Iraq, it rarely was the gender included in the roll-up. 3 members of the Taliban were killed, or 3 Islamic State fighters were killed, 3 Al-Qaeda operatives. I'm sure it was there at some point, but calling out the gender of the person killed in the strike stands out. That kind of makes you wonder why that was included. But again, we're having to read between the lines here on a lot of this. And that goes to kind of a general lack of information on what exactly is happening with this overall operation. Is it regime change? Is it simply stopping the flow of drugs? We're having some in Congress start to push back a little bit because we've gone over this in recent episodes where there are real questions about the legality of these strikes. And it's starting to take hold here where Senator Lisa Slotkin, a Democrat out of Michigan, said just a couple days ago that they have uniformed military personnel asking their chain of command for letters that ensure that they don't have personal liability for any illegal action in these operations. I don't know that I've ever heard of that, to be blunt. And you have to, that's saying a lot. That someone somewhere along the chain of command or somewhere along the approval for these strikes is saying, I don't know if this is actually legal or not. I don't know if this could come back to bite me. And they're seeking written approval from their chain of command. I don't know how much that'll hold up. Like if you think about let's go worst case scenario here and say that this is proven in a year, 5 years, 10 years, whatever, to be illegal across the board. I don't know that a doctor's note, teacher's note, if you will, absolves the people in the chain of command, but it just like if you go back to, again, not a comparison of our soldiers, our military in any way to the Nazis, but if you go back to the Nuremberg trials, this was kind of what we take a lot of our views of international law and the law of armed conflict. It's kind of how we look at a lot of those prosecutions through that lens. And one of the major takeaways was that following orders is not a viable defense. You can't say that. So I wonder in this case, even if you have it written down on a piece of paper that my boss says it's okay, is it? But big picture just points to the precarious situation that a lot of people have been put into here. What we've mentioned in recent videos is the difference between operations in the Caribbean and the global war on terror. They're operating in completely different frameworks right now. And as of this recording, we still have yet to see any publicly made legal justification for these strikes. Cartels are bad. Drugs coming to the United States are bad. Even if these guys were 100% guaranteed to be carrying those drugs to the United States, that is bad. All of that together does not make them a viable military target, according to the international rule of law and according to domestic law here in the United States. So it's murky. But we are seeing some support from the other side of the aisle. We have Senator Rick Scott saying, quote, "I'm very comfortable that the president is going to follow the law." Senator Tim Sheehy of Montana, another Republican, said, quote, "I fully support the president's strikes and urge him to do more." And then Senator Tuberville, another Republican, his office put out a note saying that he completely supports President Trump's actions. Now, that doesn't necessarily line up with the broader public. The optimist in me says that still matters. I don't know. So YouGov just ran a poll asking questions about this, and they ran it September 5th through 8th. And if I remember correctly, the 5th was the first date, the date of the first kinetic strike against a cartel boat or an alleged cartel boat. So at the point that these questions are asked, we have already begun using military force against the cartels. Keep that in the back of mind. But in this survey, and the data here, and I'll link the survey below for anybody who wants to check it out, they asked 1,114 people, all Americans age 18 or older, and asked these questions between September 5th and 8th. It showed that 62% of Americans oppose invading Venezuela, 16% support a U.S. invasion of Venezuela, 22% are not sure. This one, and you'll see this in both cases, breaks down pretty significantly by party lines. In talking about the invasion of Venezuela, 31% of Republicans support an invasion of Venezuela, whereas 9% of Democrats and independents support that invasion. Shifting over to the question of regime change, 52% of Americans oppose overthrowing Maduro, whereas 19% support it and 29% aren't sure. Again, pretty heavily broken down by party lines, where 34% of Republicans approve of our using military force to enact regime change, overthrow the Maduro regime, compared with only 8% of Democrats and 14% of independents. Now, I was looking for a question about the drone strikes or striking these cartel boats, because I feel like that's probably more relevant of a question than these hypotheticals in the future. We're not seeing that, though. And digging through this entire report, the closest we came to that was a question asking if people were in favor or opposed having naval vessels in and around Venezuela. And I feel like that's not anywhere near the same question of, do you support striking cartel boats? It's kind of the closest they got. But anyways, on that question, 35% were in favor, 38% opposed to having U.S. military vessels in and around Venezuela, which, again, so I would say more support for that than an invasion, more support for that than assisting in the overthrow of the Maduro regime. But I do want to highlight, they did not ask specifically about the drone strikes. My gut, in just seeing the public's reaction here in the last couple weeks, is there would probably be close to 50% support for the continuation of these strikes. I would assume that also falls relatively along party lines like we're seeing here, where probably greater than 50% of Republicans would say they'd like to see them continue, and maybe 25-30% of Democrats and independents in that range. Just, again, based off of kind of how this is being presented, how it's being discussed in the general public. But either way, every day that goes by, we're seeing a continued military buildup, continued ratcheting up of the tensions in Venezuela. I personally do not think that a ground invasion of Venezuela is likely. Unfortunately, I think that the snatch and grab, maybe targeted raids inside of Venezuela, is increasing in likelihood. I think that's incredibly dangerous. I don't know that that's what the American people want big picture, and I think it puts a lot of our service members in harm's way unnecessarily. But it does look like we are creeping more and more in that direction. So something we're going to have to keep an eye on. That's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.